move our conference online because of that special situation. It was necessary to do this in this bizarre and strange times. But for us, we think that for us it is a chance to meet and think with people from so many countries and so distant places. And you know, I think that being in Warsaw in November is not a very good idea in this rainy and gloomy time. Our meeting is a part of the final part of our research project, Traditions of Polish Cooperativism, which was conducted by Aleksandra Bilewicz, sociologist and historian from the Institute of Rural and Agricultural Development, Polish Academy of Sciences. Hello, Aleksandra.
Hello. Nice to meet you all.
And me, I'm the sociologist and historian of ideas from the University of Warsaw, Institute of Applied Social Sciences, and Bartłomiej Błesznowski, sorry. That's me. And last to say that this conference is not only the result of our research project, but also of our passion to the topic which we dedicated this event, the cooperation, which is the not only theoretical issue for us, but also practical activity which we dedicated our time in last years, because I'm the member of consumer cooperative Good, Dobrze in Warsaw, and Aleksandra was one of the founders, I think, of Warsaw Consumer Cooperative in last years, which was one of the pioneering organizations in this sphere in Poland. Okay, it's a good time to give a space for Aleksandra, and I think that it can be a very interesting and very useful, I hope, time for everyone. Thank you. Thank you for now. Aleksandra?
Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with you and to be able to spend the next 2 days talking about cooperativism and commoning. Firstly, I would like to welcome all to this conference. We are happy that our topic attracted attention of such an international group of researchers. On this conference, we have lecturers from 15 countries, also from beyond Europe. And I think it is a very adequate situation. Cooperation, after its birth in 1844 in the city of Rochdale, has quickly become an international worldwide movement. The International Cooperative Alliance was established in 1895. Thus, it is natural that we exchange thoughts and ideas beyond borders. Cooperatives and other institutions of the common have a long and diversified history. Therefore, we reach during this conference to historical roots, linking them with contemporary institutions of the common. This history tells us that cooperatives thrived in a time of crisis. Cooperatives were created by people oppressed by the reality of industrial capitalism. In Poland, the country where the idea of this conference originated, The birth of the cooperative movement occurred in a country divided between three empires in the 19th century. It is the slogan of Społem, together, that mobilized the divided and oppressed nation to build a grassroots culture of solidarity and economic democracy, which had a big significance to build the independent state, in building the independent state. We are all aware of the fact that today we also faced a multifaceted crisis. Neoliberalism, the rise of populism, financialization, climate change, and last but not least, the current pandemic are factors that should contribute to the rise of solidarity and mutual help. For me personally, the issue of cooperation in rural areas which face the depopulation, the agrarianization, and proletarianization is especially significant. Newly established grassroots institutions such as alternative food networks, although still on a small scale, are potentially able to counter those tendencies. Their growth and openness is vital for the future of the countryside, which should strengthen its ties to the city and in the spirit of solidarity and mutual respect. However, we have to learn from the history of cooperative institutions. After the period of grassroots mobilization and ideological fervor, cooperatives grew, became institutionalized, and lost their democratic spirit. While in the West, they were generally subsumed to capital, in the East, they were subordinated to totalitarian or authoritarian states. It seems that there is a cycle in the development of cooperative institutions. And currently, with the birth of new cooperativism, this is a term proposed by Marcello Vieta, who will give the keynote speech on this conference, we face another wave of its grassroots development. Therefore, we have to be conscious to avoid dangers and face challenges and dilemmas that the new movement poses. Among these dilemmas, we can find, for example, the issue of scale versus participation, the urge to build a community of like-minded people in terms of lifestyle and class that creates a danger of exclusivity and class bias, or the dilemma of stagnation versus development in cooperation with capital. Moreover, there are many new forms of economy that seemingly bases on the idea of cooperation, and in the reality, it serves the big players on the market. This is especially the case of some commercial forms of sharing economy. It is our task to face those new challenges on both theoretical and practical level. Some of today's and tomorrow's lectures face those issues. Cooperativism poses also theoretical challenges for philosophers and social theorists. It is not accidental that the birth of modern cooperative institutions occurred in the same time as the birth of sociology as a discipline. Today, our challenge is to build the theory of commoning. Among those challenges, we can find an old dilemma between the researchers' engagement and neutrality. We will surely face this issue during our discussions on the conference. It is also our task to rediscover the rich past of the cooperative thought and to exchange knowledge about history of cooperativism and cooperative thought of our countries. So once again, a very warm welcome for all the participants, and I hope that we have 2 fruitful days ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ola. I think that those threats posed by the development of community economy and cooperativism are going hand in hand with chances and hopes. Maybe it's only my opinion. These chances and hopes, especially in the thinking about new communal practices in the future, which are very necessary, and because of that, this conference is dedicated to create a kind of laboratory to think about not only historical forms of mutualism, like guilds, some utopian communities from 19th century, or traditional cooperatives. But today, maybe we should think cooperativism as a chance to constitute a proposal for global reconstruction and remedy for problems, and especially social economical problems, and especially for climate change. Which in my opinion is today something similar to what was called in 19th century social question. Why? Because like this question in 19th century, now climate in general is a fundamental issue for any mass political project, and in the second hand, it is a kind of materialistic materialization or materialistic turn of philosophy in the face of the real real possible end of our history. Yeah, and I think that it is a kind of final point of many disciplines now. For example, and maybe especially for economy, the climate change is a catalyst for transforming economical thinking and changing perspective for the discipline as a social science, not only a mathematical, very strictly treating discipline of numbers. And this changing perspective is especially for treating not human beings from our environment in our society. I think that we should think community wider, not only as this not human beings, not only as a passive resource, like Marx said in Capital, in the first sentence of Capital, an immense accumulation of commodities. Yes, we should think about this external to human entities, not as an active actors and the members of a kind of world social cooperation. And because of that, social is something more than only human things. And I think that because of that, our economical thinking must overcome something what should be called, I think, as an economization. Economization of our thinking and politics, fetishizing private property, treating criterion of economic efficiency as a natural measure of public activity, and the acceptance of for assemblage of market and the state as a natural model of community. We should think about other forms and other steps of our of human and social development in this general sense. How to stop climate change, how to reduce pollutions, limit further forms of environmental destruction. I think that the main thing, the main issue is taking communal power on natural resources. I think that ecology, this old word ecology, not popular today, is extremely political matter. Not only because it requires influence on global power institutions, but because it concerns redefinition of the polis itself. Yeah, the polis as a place to live, not only for human kind, but also those external beings. And because of that, I think that subject of social sciences and economy, as I said, is also political. It is rather something common than, and in the case of economy, it is rather common than only property, the commodity. And in this scope, the cooperation, which is in the title of our conference, can take, for the first one, it's completely meaning, yeah, activity by which a human can enter into the new and new relationship with the social world in this general sense. And this is why we ask about social relations, which can allow us to, on the one hand, build alternatives to our current sociability. Maybe this sociability now is very similar to capitalism. And on the second hand, and because of that, as a result, overcome our economic and climate and now also epidemical problems, because for many people, COVID-19 epidemic is a result of climate change as a global process. Those relations and those the social interactions are the base of what we are calling this second word in the title of our conference, commoning. Commoning as an attempt to write a new constitution or new principles for social natural world. Outside the principle of ownership and exploitation of social and natural resources. In this case, I think that we should describe commoning as a self-government, or in the other level, self-consciousness of political cooperation in various areas, in climate, space, technology, languages, cultures, because it doesn't mean any particular pattern, any model of organization. It is rather something more possible, yeah? Various possible patterns of institutionalization of the common. And finally, I think that because of those presuppositions, we want to analyze during this conference how, for the first hand, how historical experiences, how be useful and used today to build this new community and to fix for our social problems, and as well as how what new forms of organization we are seeing in our current world. Yeah, what these forms of organization based on the principle of the common, these laboratories of change. I think that for now it is enough for us. In about 5 minutes, we are starting the first session, which will be dedicated especially to this principle of the common, yeah, and commoning as some philosophy. Thank you all for being here before 10. For me, sometimes it's too much without coffee. And we have a maybe 4 minutes break now to the next session. Thank you once again. Okay, that's a time for Mikołaj Ratajczak, the assistant professor in Institute of Philosophy and Sociology of Polish Academy of Sciences, and the session dedicated to the commoning, the principle of the common, the philosophy of the what we called common. Yeah, Mikołaj.
Yes, hello everybody. Welcome to the first session and the main session of today of the conference. It's my great privilege and even greater pleasure to chair this panel and to be able to introduce the three great speakers that we are going to hear from today. The session is dedicated to the theoretical, both theoretical and historical aspects of the most basic, most fundamental practices that make up the base of the institutions of the common. So the practices of the underclasses, popular classes, classes that, well, mostly try to satisfy their basic needs and therefore build social relations of symbiosis, of cooperation, and of commoning. So we're going to hear about the basic concepts for the philosophy or the theory of commoning, of the common, meaning symbiosis, commoning, cooperation, and the speakers will try to present us the history of those practices. And we are going to also hear about a bit about the intellectual history of the Polish cooperative movement. So I'm going to introduce each speaker individually before he presents his paper. Each speaker will have about 20 minutes to present their papers, and I would like to do it that way, that we first hear from all three speakers and then move to the questions. Is it okay for the organizers?
Yes, that's what we thought it should look like. Yeah.
Great. So we're going to hear from, in this order, Michał, Pospiszyl, Łukasz, Moll, and Cezary Rudnicki. As I said, I will introduce each speaker individually before he speaks. Then, after we hear all three presentations, we're going to move towards the questions. So, the first speaker we're going to hear from is Dr. Michał Pospiszyl, who is a philosopher and culture theorist. He works as an assistant professor at the Institute of Political Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences and is right now a visiting fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. He's the author or co-editor of many articles, many journal issues, as well as 3 volumes. 2 he authored as the main author. It was Stop the History, Walter Benjamin and the Minority Materialism, book published in 2016. And his most recent forthcoming book, which was nominated for the Polish Prize for the Best Metaphysical Essay this year. And the book is entitled Plague, an essay on the relationship of the state and the pathogens. And he also co-edited a book with Katarzyna Czeczot, an anthology of romantic anti-capitalism. He's the editor, one member of the editorial collective of Theoretical Practice journal, which I'm also a part of. Michał Pospiszyl is going to present his paper entitled Symbiosis of Cooperation on Origin of Communism, dealing mostly with the concept of cooperation in Marx. It's going to be a critical rereading, critical reevaluation of the concept of cooperation from the perspective of the history of popular classes. Michał, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me and see me? Okay, so I share the screen. And I'm starting reading my paper. The history of concepts of cooperation and symbiosis is interesting and shows how these 2 notions were converting or diverting in significant ways. Contemporary meanings of cooperation and symbiosis were both defined in the 19th century, although in modern languages, European languages, these words were appearing already in the 17th century. Secondly, almost from the very beginning, symbiosis and cooperation have been used to describe both biological and economical phenomena. In the case of the concept of cooperation, the matter seems rather clear. In English, it was already in use in the 17th century, but only from the mid-1800s onwards it started to gain specific significance. It appears that in the 3 different contexts. Firstly, in the context of the organizations of workers and producers, or self-help associations, at the time mainly under the patronage of Robert Owen. Secondly, the idea of cooperation provides means to describe the working of the modern factory. This can be seen, for instance, in the extremely influential book, The Philosophy of Manufactures, written by Andrew Yu in 1835. Here, cooperation is supposed to explain the qualitative differences between the pre-modern and modern way of organizing work. It explains how the jumble of workers and machines can turn into one large organism, which, thanks to new technologies and strict division of labor, produces faster and more effectively than the traditional organized manufacture. Karl Marx refers to both of these meanings. One, in the first volume of Capital, where he writes about cooperation in the capitalist factory, then in the 3rd volume in the context of cooperatives. Marx is probably the first writer to combine both of these meanings. In Capital, the cooperative is an institution which makes use of technological achievements and the capitalist way of organizing work, which differs from the factory only in the form of ownership, social instead of private, and which represent an even higher degree of organization, cooperation, and productivity. But more or less at the same time, that is around 1859, cooperation gains a 3rd meaning, different from the other 2, which were strictly linked with economy. Namely, it becomes one of the technical terms of the theory of evolution. It appears for the first time in the chapter 8 F. Charles Darwin on the origin of species, and it is then developed mostly by Peter Kropotkin, for whom it becomes the main mechanism behind the evolutionary success. And what about the history of the notion of symbiosis? Similarly, as cooperation, also symbiosis becomes a technical term of the biology in the second half of the 19th century. It is due to Albert B. Frank, who used the term in the study of lichens and fungi as earlier and as in 1876, and Anton de Barry, who introduced the word into the biological dictionary in 1878. Interestingly, de Barry formulated a rather broad definition of symbiosis, which includes 3 types of relationships: parasitism, commensalism, and mutuality. Although in the language of economics or politics, the notion of symbiosis has never gained a significance even comparable to that of cooperation, still it always implied something more than a strict biological relation. First of all, as early as at the beginning of the 17th century, hence way before it starts to appear in the natural sciences, it already functions in the common language, referring mainly to the social life and situation of friendly coexistence of individuals or communities. Later on, mutuality, that is, according to Barry's later classification, a close relationship beneficial for both sides, is also translated into economic terms by Pierre Proudhon in his philosophy of poverty. Here, mutualism designs such a social system in which capitalist competition and accumulation are replaced by a network of small owners interested in caring for and helping each other as means of their survival and defense against capital. Similarly, la mutualité in France and the 1830s provides a name for a social movement then organized into associations of social help, still active. But there's another term which in this blend of languages of biology and economics or politics most often comes to the fore, namely of competition. Although thanks to the recent research of the works like books written by Elizabeth Ross and Poland and Justyna Schollenberger, we know that his opinions on these matters were far from simple. It is undoubtedly Darwin who introduced to biology the theory of the natural selection, set primarily in the terms of the struggle for existence and competition. It is also known, particularly important here, that while working on the description of this mechanism in 1838, Darwin reads an essay on the principle of population of Malthus. The concept of the struggle and competition mediated by biology will return in the following decades in economics and political theory. For instance, in the theories of Herbert Spencer or Max Nordau, as well in the today's sociology or even in the ecology or movement. As the effects of success of the both alliance, the alliance of modern biology with the ideologies of racial struggle or aggressive free market competition, the biological foundation of such behaviors as mutual aid, solidarity, or cooperation, which have been evident for the thinkers like Kropotkin or William Marx and William Morris, became unobvious and problematic, at least within the mainstream of 20th century critical theory. This breakdown had numerous consequences. For instance, widespread becomes the view that competition, combat, race, or gender hierarchy are distinctly natural phenomena. As a result, it was believed that to establish an order devoid of them and thus free of racist, patriarchy, or competition would require an enormous amount of violence to somehow pull the man out of the brutal state of nature. This was also the case, perhaps, even then and ever, when it is in the case of Robin Lysenko and his communist political biology. Serious attempts were made to create a new man by the means of natural sciences. Another consequence of this breakup was the modernist idea of the subjugation not only of the wilderness of man, but of the whole of nature, understood as an element by definition threatening to any stable social structure. In the 20th century, the main tools of this subjugation were pesticides, herbicides, and antibiotics, accessories of the modern dream of a second nature, completely controlled by man. Today, in the era of the climate crisis, we can clearly see that after decades of such subjugation, creation of something like a second nature was a dream which to the extent came true. Unexpectedly, however, the second nature has shown its colors, proving to be even more savage and unpredictable than anything we could have imagined before. Today, better than in the 19th century, we know that creating a stable, more reliable communities with other people as well as other species can only be achieved through symbiosis, that is living together with what is natural and one. It can be achieved by working together with biological diversity and making use of the richness rather than by subordinating the biological elements to the logic of monocultural plantation. At this point, we can go back to the question of symbiosis and cooperation and consider how these two concepts can be useful for the analysis of the crisis and its possible overcoming. Or, to use the terms proposed by organizers in the invitation for this conference, we could ask, is the commoning, the creation of institutional common, as promising answers to today's crisis, are accompanied rather by cooperation or by symbiosis? Obviously, I have neither tools or no space for a comprehensive answer to both questions, but I will try to outline their background. We have seen that the lineage of these two concepts are slightly different. The concept of cooperation is a product of modernity, a tool of describe the operation of a capitalist factory. Even when it appears in socialist writings, it is usually presented as a more developed dialectical successor to the capitalist order. The cooperative is to benefit from the technological and organizational achievements of capitalism, and to use them for creation of a more horizontal but also more effective institutions, bringing greater benefits to each and every individual. There is no doubt that this concept is constructed within the framework of a liberal political ontology. The labor power, the individual worker, the individual subject are the basic units of analysis. This subject, if he only makes the appropriate calculation, if he only acts according to his individual selfish interest, should choose cooperation rather than destructive competition. And we know that both in modern economics and in the theory of evolution, this calculation proves rather correct. Indeed, economically and evolutionary cooperation in the long run pays off more than the competition in the vast majority of cases. With the concept of symbiosis, things look quite different. At first glance, it could seem that even Proudhon, when describing the network of small producers, not quite unlikely as in the Adam Smith's fantasy of pre-capitalist barter-based exchange, observes mutualist phenomena through the same liberal lens. He too, the abstract individual human, would be the basic unit of analysis. As if a man, in order to establish any social relations, was indeed obliged to first sign a contract, and yet the symbiotic communities Proudhon writes about are fundamentally different from the cooperatives, at least such as they were understood by the Marxist tradition. These communities are something else than mere outcomes of the capitalist relations of production or of a dialectical movement of abolition and preservation. What Proudhon proposed is to think in terms of an outside of producing of the institutions which protect the emerging social autonomy. This is a quote. Beneath the governmental machinery, in the shadow of political institutions, out of the sight of statesmen and priests, society is producing its own organism, slowly and silently, and constructing a new order and the expression of its vitality and autonomy and denial of the old politics as well as of the old religion. Although Proudhon, like Marx, formulates his program in the language of liberal political philosophy, he goes beyond the liberal paradigm to a much greater extent than most of the classical Marxists. I believe that this philosophy finds way of expression of these social forces which resist in passive, weak, quiet, but permanent way the powers of the modern state in capitalism. Proudhon may have been not enough of an outstanding thinker to create a completely new language of analysis, hence his attachment to the idea of liberal agreements, but he was sensitive enough to hear that the social program that emerged from the mid-19th century struggle is not a program of dialectical abolition of capitalism, but a program of extending and defending of social autonomy. The wider, the more willed, the more diverse this autonomy was, the greater the stability of the institution of commons created within. Such a program is connected with a completely different political ontology. The basic unit of analysis is no longer identified with individual subject, the homo economicus, who freely and rationally choose cooperation over competition. This goal is not to increase the effectiveness of every and each individual. It is not about the common good as an effect or goal of cooperation. The common is the beginning, not the end. Omnia sunt communia is not a slogan nor a postulate, but a descriptive sentence. At the most basic level of analysis, everything we have and everything we are comes from others, from societies, from our neighbors, friends, families, from the environment we live in. As write Pierre Erdot and Christian Lavaux in Proudhon philosophy, all individuals are always already plural, always already involved in community activity, and always in depth before being created. Our so-called individual force is already part of the collective force because everyone is a combination of multiple components drawn from our education and our continuous socialization. The idea of a world divided into separate species, organisms fighting for survival, or selfish gens was invented very recently as a kind of utopian project, counterintuitive for the vast majority of social actors. Today we know that from the perspective of the evolutionary science, this idea is highly controversial, as it is symbiosis, not the struggle for existence that stands behind the creation and reproduction of life. It is also, perhaps most importantly, proves to be completely inadequate from the point of view of the global climatically endangered coexistence. Adapting of such political ontology brings about more essential benefit. One more essential benefit. It significantly broadens the view of the history of class struggles, seeing the social conflict as a ceaseless and universal struggle against the processes of enclosure, of lands, of species, of organisms. Therefore, it becomes possible to go beyond that inaccurate story which naturalizes capitalist relations, presenting them as almost eternal and almost universal forms of life, only exceptionally and locally interrupted by strikes, uprisings, or revolutions. Meanwhile, as we know from the works of the historians such as Silvio Federici, Thompson, and James C. Scott, apart from this short moment of heroic intensification, the real class struggle looks quite otherwise and sets for itself quite different goals. Much more often, it should be identified with defense of the existing forms of the commons, or with attempts to expand and reproduce them, than with a conscious political struggle for the complete abolition of hierarchy, violence, and power. What is really at stake here is the continuous process of the commoning of life, of the symbiosis, and thus literally of living together with all the richness of species, ethnicity, and gender. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michał. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. Could you please stop sharing? Oh, yeah, thank you. Okay. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. As usual, it is with the Zoom conferences, it's a pity we cannot hear people clapping for the person who was presenting. I think that your presentation will gather a lot of claps, although I'm interested whether it would also gather some critical comments. We shall see when we move to the question part. Now we move to the second speaker. The second speaker is Dr. Łukasz Moll, who is a philosopher and a sociologist. He works as the assistant professor at the Institute of Sociology of the Wrocław University. And he's also the head of the project Idea of Europe in the context of migration crisis, which he conducts at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology of the Polish Academy of Sciences. He's also a member of the editorial collective of the Praktyka Teoretyczna journal, and his apart from being academic, he is also well known for his interventions on the ongoing political issues. In his research, Łukasz is mostly dealing with the theoretical and historical aspects of the plebeian commons, or the plebeian institutions of the common, or plebeian practices of common. And today we're going to hear another presentation from his ongoing research on the subject, which is entitled Commoning as the New Philosophy of Praxis, between flaneurs and glaneuse. And it is going to be devoted to, once again, both theoretical and historical aspects of the practice of gleaning, waste, leftover spoilage collection. So, Łukasz, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mikołaj, and thank you for the organizers for giving me opportunity to participate in this panel. My current research is on the plebeian commons and commoning, and the material that I'm going to share with you today was recently published in more extensive form in the journal Praktyka Teoretyczna. On the slide, you can find the reference to my article. I also invite you to follow my blog with the excerpts from the literature on the plebeian commons. At the beginning, I would like to situate my intervention in the field of the new social theories of the commons. As you perfectly know, the concept of the commons, once marginal and obscure, undergoes its renaissance in contemporary social sciences. And I claim that the similar operation of discovery of the forgotten concept is taking place right now around the term commoning. I welcome this turn of events with satisfaction because situation commoning at the center of social theory helps us to understand that the commons are not things, resources, or properties. Bringing social practice, commoning, to the front of the discourse should make us aware that there are no commons without the whole bunch of social practices of its reproduction, maintaining, caring, sharing, defending, governing, transforming, and building alliances between different subjectivities. These practices makes us commoners, the guardians of the commons. But I'm afraid that the success of revaluation of commoning came at cost. I'm rather troubled by the fashionable tendency of seeing commoning almost everywhere around us. I'm troubled with this tendency because it may lead to the banalization of the concept and the practice. If forms of commoning are to be found, as David Bollier and Silke Hilfreich claim, in modern urban skyscrapers, as well as in remote rural villages destroyed by earthquakes in Nepal, in artistic communities and educational and research settings, and in the community forests of India and the many self-organized communities of cyberspace, then I begin to have serious doubts about the subversive potential of commoning. If we reduce commoning to simple cooperation, to doing things together, then we have to ask ourselves, what's all the fuss about? Let's remember the warning that Karl Marx issued in his chapter on cooperation in the first volume of Capital. Cooperation serves as a lifeblood for capital. Moreover, in capitalism, cooperative practices fall under despotic forms of control. And in the history of capitalism, the increase of cooperation normally leads only to the modernization of despotism. Here, the recent phase of capitalism is curious enough. Commoning is more and more regarded not as a threat, but as a possible remedy for the crisis logic of capital. As Massimo De Angelis rightly observed, there is a widespread hope that there will be common fix of capitalism on the horizon, namely that the attributes assigned to commoning will be useful when it comes to dealing with barriers for accumulation, such as reproduction of the planet, reproduction of the household, social capital in workplace, or producing knowledge in network society. So I see this success story of the term commoning rather as an ambivalent phenomenon. I see here the risk of banalization of this set of practices and, in effect, the risk of depriving them of their radical potentiality. So I see the success story of commoning rather as an ambivalent phenomenon. I see here the risk of banalization of this set of practices and, in effect, the risk of depriving them of their radical potentiality, the potentiality to overcome capitalism towards the system in which egalitarian social reproduction could replace the accumulation of capital as the organizing principle of the world. So the main question that I would like to pose today goes like this. What makes commoning a subversive practice? Or in other words, when commoning becomes dangerous for capital? I see many possible routes to take to answer this question, but right here I have time to choose only one of them. It will be the most messianic and ephemeral one, to be sure, but I believe that it will help us to uncover a couple of fleeting, but at the same time vital, features of subversive commoning. I would like to concentrate on one particular form of commoning, which is the practice of gleaning. And I claim that gleaning is more than a mere example. There is a rich and fascinating history of gleaning as the traditional right of the poor and as the customary practice defended by commoners all around the world in different historical epochs. We could mention here the biblical figure of the gleaning Ruth, who was a widow, an orphan, but also a stranger and foreigner, Moabite among the Jews, and who received the right to glean after the harvest. Ruth became the most famous female gleaner in history and the symbol of the traditional right of the poor, especially destitute women, widows, and orphans, to gain direct access to subsistence. We could add cases from outside the Judeo-Christian world, for example, the Islamic principle of zakat, that is, of redistribution of the portion of wealth for the needy after the harvest. James C. Scott recognized gleaning in Malaysian villages as one of the weapons of the weak, of informal and hidden practices of subversion and cooperation. And there would be many chapters of the history of gleaning to add here. Gleaning wood, berries, and peat on the commons as the part of moral economy of the English working class, as described by E.P. Thompson. Gleaning herbs by female commoners who became accused of witchcraft in the advent of capitalism, as we know from the research by Silvia Federici. The right to glean as a postulate of revolutionary peasants in Germany, the tradition that survived to the times of Karl Marx and his articles on the theft of wood from forests. The right to glean chips, that is to say, to collecting the refuse from the shipyards and ports in 18th century England in times of establishing the wage labor, as it was demonstrated by Peter Limbaugh or finally contemporary forms of gleaning that we can find in the informal sphere of urban recyclers called catadores, cartoneros, or binners, who perform an outstanding job in recovering rare, non-renewable resources and face criminalization and violence from the authorities. So the history of gleaning is often neglected history of plebeian resistance, of protesting against the enclosures of the commons, and of demanding the unconditional right to the means of subsistence. It is also the history of solidarity in survival and cooperation in struggle. And finally, it is the history of refusal of accepting the separation between the proletarians and wealth. That's why commoning in general and gleaning in particular stand in the way of the continuous primitive accumulation of capital, continuous enclosures, privatizations, and plunders of the commons. In her recent book, Potential History, Ariera Aisha Azolai has reminded us that the progressive movement of capital was from the very start driven by the logic of imperialism, of destroying the multiple worlds of the commons and of instituting in their place the divisions between people and things. When our sources of reproduction become private property, when our resources become commodified, and when our communal modes of living together become extinct, then gleaning could be read as the last breath of the dying world. In the enclosed landscape, full of division of work and status, the gleaner seems to be a troubling character. She violates private property, she trespasses without permission, she reproduces herself outside the slavery of wage labor, and she reproduces the world around her by giving the new life to the leftovers of the capitalist production. Of course, we could reply here immediately that maybe she is a marvelous character, but let's be honest, her practice is far from revolutionary. We might empathize with her, but hardly to place serious political hopes with her activities. There is a long tradition of seeing the plebeian subjectivities in terms of pure negativity, passivity, and idleness. We all know this story, which is being told not only from the perspective of the dominant classes, but also from the big part of the political left, which remains attached to the progressivist myth of productivism. The history goes on like this. Lumpen proletarians, the rabble, the paupers, all those masterless men with their frivolous lifestyles may be romantic, but they just feed on scraps. We find here nothing more than the instinct of the poor, to use Karl Marx's term, which drives them to gleaning on the margins of our society. And the truly revolutionary practice is to be found somewhere else, in the figure of the male adult worker who through his labor not only produces economic value and transforms the world, but also is predestined to overcome the separation between the human subject and his objects. This idea of revolutionary praxis found its full expression in Georgi Lukács' dialectical Marxism. Lukács was interested in approaching proletariat as the revolutionary historical subject. It is through and thanks to proletariat that the separation between subjectivity and objectivity will cease one day to exist. In the self-conscious practice, the proletariat will bring the end to the reification of society and will initiate in this way the universal liberation. That was the assumption. What Lukács proposed could be interpreted as the elegant solution to the problem that commoners refused to accept. Lukács agreed to the initial separation of the worker and the capital as the necessary stage of dialectical movement of history, and he tried to overcome this split. Commoners, on the contrary, insisted on the need to defend the communal modes of living. From the perspective of progressivist Marxism, their communist stance appeared as worrisome. The enclosures of the commons and the abolition of communal structures of late feudalism were treated as the necessary step in the narrative of human emancipation. Without the liberation of workers from the soil and serfdom, there will be no progress at all, and without further progress, there will be no communism in the future. That's why, from the progressivist point of view, our gleaner is just a remnant of the old times. As French daily newspaper History summed up such a view in the issue from the year 1870, rag pickers represent primitive mankind in the big city, blissfully ignorant of laws, happy with non-entities, imbued with their vegetative way of life, retiring from society like a troglodyte of the caves. But what I propose here is to change the perspective, to refuse, as a good commoner would do, the conviction that the progressive movement is necessarily unlimited and unstoppable. Only from the point of view of linear history, gleaning appears as an ancient or backward phenomenon. If we leave aside this conviction, at least for a moment, then we will be able to approach our gleaner from another angle. Let's call it the angle of Agnès Varda, the great French new wave film director. Her movie, The Gleaners and I, is an impressive meditation on multiple forms that gleaning still have in contemporary societies. Varda tried to show how overcoming of the separation between the destitute proletarian and her means of subsistence might be possible thanks to gleaning. It is, of course, different overcoming that Łukasz had in mind. Gleaning does not take place in factory in the process of production. It takes place at the outskirts of factory, where there are wastes, human wastes and non-human wastes. On the one side, we've got broken equipment, old furniture, discarded food and leftovers from harvest of grapes, tomatoes or potatoes. On the other side, there are gatherers in cities, in villages, around the supermarkets and in the fields, tinkerers, oysters, fishermen, gypsies in informal buildings, and freeganist youth. Gleaning is here this peculiar, even if hard to grasp, clandestine and shaky kind of praxis, which works on the reverse side of the system and helps to resurrect dead objects. Maybe we should even leave the binary subject-object aside. In the world of human wastes, whose lives are composed by wastes, the practice of gleaning serves not as an appropriation, but rather as a mediation, as the act of arranging new constellations. Thus, gleaning should be not reduced to collecting resources. It is more than that. It is about reproduction of the common life. Every act of gleaning is a calm refusal of the world of enclosures and the invitation to glean together. And Varda is a skillful gleaner herself. Her filmmaking is devoted to arranging constellations. She seeks for the fleeting manifestations of gleaning, just as gleaner seek for the leftovers after the harvest. And she composes her narrative in a patchy and torn way, just as gleaners build their homes from scratch. In that way, Varda helps us to see that, contrary to its common misperception, gleaning is far from non-innovative, repetitive, and recurrent practice. New arrangements and alliances are always possible, just as the technological developments are possible here too. In fact, they are possible because commoners are not reduced to the position of naked workforce or the buyers of commodities. Their collective capacities are far from limited. As you probably noticed, my reading of Varda's movie and of gleaning itself is indebted to Walter Benjamin's work. Benjamin's concept of dialectical image or transhistorical constellation certainly inspired Varda's filmmaking. As the opponent of progressive, linear conception of history, Benjamin was sensitive to traditions of the oppressed, and he was also aware that there exist in capitalist society multiple temporalities. Each of them offers us some material for the historical rapture. According to Benjamin, instead of placing our hopes in progress, even in progress corrected by reforms or accelerated by the revolution, we should remain attentive to the possibilities that became repressed by the forces of capitalism and modernity. And we should try to liberate them. That doesn't mean that we should seek for the return to the good old times or to simply renew the lost struggles from the past. The clock reset is not possible, nor even desirable, but it is possible and desirable to rearrange our common world, just as the gleaner does. That's why the practice of collecting the remnants was so vital also for Benjamin. But we have to be careful here. I claim that there are at least two different philosophies of collecting as praxis in Benjamin. The first one is symbolized by the famous figure of the flaneur. The second one by the more marginal character of the rag picker. It is only the second one that is compatible with my conceptualization of gleaning as the subversive praxis of the powerless. The flaneur is a stroller, a longer in the big modern city with its consumerist culture. He wanders through the streets and among the shop windows and assemblages of commodities, contemplating the forces of modernity. The flaneur is the collector of experiences and the constructor of constellation. He dreams about the liberation from the realm of capitalist spectacle. His desires are expanded by consumerist capitalism, but he cannot find satisfaction in the eternal return of the same. Fashion trends, novelties, and innovations are deprived of anything authentically new. He tends to believe that one day technological progress could fulfill the promises of modernity had it been used differently. Thus, he has a chance to become the gleaner? I don't think so. Following Susan Buck-Morss, I would say that his gaze is too contemplative, too dependent on the urban spectacle to detach him from the world of bourgeoisie. He may be detached in the crowd, but he is overwhelmed by its power. But there is also a different collector in the work of Benjamin. I would like to ascribe here to the proposition put forward by S.D. Chrostowska, that the real equivalent of the glaneuse in Benjamin's writings is to be found not in the figure of flaneur, but in the figure of the rag picker. It appears in Benjamin also in German version as the Lumpensammler, and in the French one as chiffonnier. The rag picker is detached from the crowd, but not deliberately, to live as a blessed dandy, as in the case of the flaneur. 19th century representations tended to portray rag pickers as motley crews with strange dialects and customs. The clandestine underworld was like dialectical image itself. The crucial thing to understand is that, as it was stressed by Irving Wolfart, the rag picker is not meant to help to realize the potential of history better or faster. The recourse to the waste should occur not in order to develop perfect zero waste recycling or to make capitalism more efficient or green. The rag picker appears firstly to accuse with his presence alone, to uncover the fact that capitalist history creates waste amounting to the size of ruins, and secondly, and more crucially, the rag picker is the one who liberates the lost time, who recovers things not in order to bring them back to capitalist circulation, but to withhold them. As the liberator of the commons, the rag picker recovers them from the prehistory and from the margins of history. His multicolored coat, composed by rags, may be interpreted as the symbol of Benjamin's historical praxis. Different temporalities are juxtaposed with each other to create cracks in the continuity of capitalist history. Contrary to the flaneur, the rag pickers and gleaners remain highly distrustful of every promise of progress and technological solutionism. They rather try to pull the bourgeois history to a halt before it ends in the climate catastrophe. Their powerless force is of a messianic sort. It brings salvation to things and people. It gives them afterlife. In order to bring change in time, they try to change the concept of time itself. That's why the historical materialist, as the philosopher of praxis, should be compared to the rag picker. The only work that the historical materialist may finish is the one of detaching himself from the dominant history with a barricade made from lumber and to defend in that way the vast world of commoning. The transhistorical task of liberating the commons from the history of enclosures and accumulation awaits for its fulfillment. And let's leave this task, as in the good Hollywood romance, for a newly wedded couple, for the glaneuse and the rag picker. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Łukasz. Yeah, thank you for that you stop sharing the screen. As usual, your presentations are full of very interesting material, both historical and visual. So many thanks for this interesting PhD in philosophy from the Warsaw University. The title of his dissertation was The Ethics of the Care of the Self, according to Michel Foucault. But Cezary is also very well known for his, as far as I'm counting properly, about 10 years of intensive work in popularizing philosophy and the theory of commoning of cooperatives. Right now, he is active as an independent scholar, working mostly in the field of post-structuralist philosophy, history of cooperativism and of cooperative philosophy, as well as the Christian and pagan ethics. This one's quite interesting in his in his field of interest. Today we're going to hear from Cezary on the things I think he does best, if I can share with you my personal opinion, meaning it is going to be a dive into a political and theoretical history of Polish cooperative philosophy. The title of his paper is The Cooperative Theory of Alliance. It's going to be an elaboration on the political aspects of creating networks of cooperatives, and Cezary is going to be base his reflections on the work of Edward Abramowski and Jan Wolski. So, Cezary, you have the voice.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Yes.
Yeah, very well.
I didn't prepare any presentation, so I will just speak. And now I think that the better title will be a prelude to the cooperative theory of alliance, or maybe outline. The essential problem of my paper is an organizational form of the institutions of the common, especially of the co-ops. I divided my presentation into two parts. At first, I will set up a rather abstract theoretical framework and discuss the organization form problem as such. Then I will present the conception of a multi-level federalism formulated in the first half of 20th century by some Polish cooperative activists and theorists. So let's begin with the first part. All efforts of organizing the separate elements into a functional structures are constantly faced with two perils. On the one hand, the element can be put together too tightly, which precludes any movement. That is, it precludes any dynamics, any possibility of metamorphosis. I call it a density of a structure, because this kind of structure is too dense to allow any change. Neither new facts, nor solutions, nor needs will find their place here. Everything has its place in the a priori top-down plan. Nothing unexpected can happen. Excuse me. And every difference between the elements is fixed in the form of hierarchies and power relations. As a consequence, such a structure will become, rather sooner than later, a conservative one. The elements can be replaced, but the structure as such, the structure as a pure form of positions, must be preserved and reproduced. On the other hand, we have dispersion. This kind of structure is a dynamic one. The movement of elements or of structural position is possible, but the relations between those elements are weak and momentary. Here, the change isn't the metamorphosis of structure, but rather its constant disintegration. Every shape, every form that occurs disappears almost immediately. Any real functional structure must be something in between those two opposite poles. Consider, for example, the case of theory making, of thinking. If the links between theoretical concepts are too dense, we deal with dogmatism. All new facts are rejected or misinterpreted. Definitions and axioms are indisputable. Scientific progress is impossible. Dogmatic theory can only be reproduced in orthodox commentaries. No heterogeneity is acceptable. On the other hand, we have madness as an example of dispersion. Connections between the concept, statement, and facts are too weak and too momentary. Changes are too fast. Dispersed theory cannot properly fulfill the explanatory and predictive functions. Truly functional theory must be something in between these two extremes. The relations between the concept, axioms, and statement should be intense, but not permanent. Changeable, temporary, but not momentary. The structure of such a theory should have enough, let's say, empty spaces for the new facts and for the transformation of all theoretical components. Any organization of the institution of the common, especially the efforts to network those institutions, to associate the efforts to associate them in a kind of league or alliance, meet those two perils as well. Let me focus, at least on the beginning, on the coops. First, what would dispersion means in this case? Under what circumstances do the relations between the individual coops remain weak and only momentary? I think we can observe this precisely in the case of contemporary cooperatives, at least the Western ones. Most of the enterprises interact with each other only on the basis of competitive free market. There are no structural requirements that would oblige coops to buy products only from other coops, to keep money and take loans only from cooperative banks, to insure its members in the mutual insurances, to cooperate with trade unions, and so on and so on. When such a cooperative buys products from another, it does more so by accident. It might as well buy them from a company or private entrepreneur if they can only provide better prices. There are also no obstacles that would prevent a particular coop from withdrawal from the coop's network or association. An example can be here Mondragon. Several coops that used to be associated in Mondragon Corporation left it to seek greater profit outside of the association. This whole situation is what John Ristakes, in his book Humanizing the Economy, presented with affirmation as a market-based cooperativism. This market-oriented cooperativism is nothing else but one of the perils mentioned before, the dispersion of coops structure. On the other hand, there are coops and coops association that throws in the hierarchical forms, with the board more and more alienated from the rank and file members, with a kind of central planning which homogenizes the needs and goals of the community and leaves no space for individual desires and needs of minority. Most of the decisions made here are top-down, and democracy is limited to the election of management or similar simple voting. Participation in the life of such a cooperative is purely fictional. Members can vote, that's of course true, but they do not have the proper conditions to take any initiative. Their sense of responsibility is weakening, as well as their collective resourcefulness. According to Jan Wolski, a cooperative theoretist and activist living in the 20th century, this loss of democratic competencies is especially pervasive in the large communities, where the individual is lost in mass. This is the density in the case of coops. Its most extreme variant appears on the level of coops associations, in the form of statism, of coops subordination to the state apparatus and its central planning. Here in Poland, we experience almost 50 years of such a cooperativism. The advocate of this system, as he called it, socialist organic cooperativism, is Karl Ratner, an author of the Cooperation, Community and Coops in a Global Era. Of course, he condemns the the distortions of so-called real socialism and calls for a truly democratic state. But his examples of organic cooperation, family and army leave no doubt. Are there any institutions that are less democratic than these two? Although Ratner's critique of contemporary apolitical, individualistic, capitalism-based cooperativism is valid, in my opinion, he does not see that his proposition puts us right back into the second structural peril. Before presenting an alternative solution, let me put the problem once again, but from a different standpoint, different angle. On the one hand, we have small co-ops where everyone knows each other, bonds between people are strong, and members are willing to take an initiative. But at the same time, those co-ops are fragile, easily go bust. They have weak market position, and because of that, they often lead to the self-exploitation of their members. On the other hand, we have large, strong, dynamically developing cooperative leagues, which associate a lot of small co-ops and are quite often supported by government or are part of state apparatus. But at the same time, they retain only a superficial sham democracy. They suppress their members, they suppress their members' activity and initiative, and quite often suppress any diversity, either dispersion or density. How to release ourselves from this disastrous alternative? I would like to base my answer, or maybe rather an outline of an answer to this question, on the concepts formulated in the first half of 20th century by three Polish cooperative activists and theorists, Edward Abramowski, Jerzy Kołakowski, and Jan Wolski. For all three, cooperativism wasn't only a matter of improving the economic position of its followers. It was also a matter of empowerment, of improving members' democratic competences. Edward Abramowski wrote about the institutions of the common, or association as he called them. I quote, "We meet here with the most important principles of democracy. The legislative authority rests in the hands of a whole. Everyone has the right of initiative. There is complete freedom to criticize and propagandize. The executive authority, which arises from direct elections, is responsible to the whole in all its actions, and at the same time is subject to the will of the majority in every important affair." End of quote. However, all this is possible, as Jerzy Kołakowski and Jan Wolski observed, only in small organizations. With the size comes passivity and susceptibility of demagogy. Hitherto, co-op structure, wrote Kołakowski, is suitable only for the really small organizations, and in the large institutions, it does not protect the individual from getting lost in mass. And yet, the co-op's growth is not only possible, but also desirable. The way out of this deadlock is, argued Kołakowski, a multi-level federalism. Already at this point, I must admit that I feel I do not meet all the set goals. So I'd like to ask you to treat the next part of my presentation rather as an indication of the direction than a full-fledged proposal. So what is the multi-level federalism? According to Kołakowski's vision, in every co-op, members should be divided into small teams of users or workers. Such a team should be, let's say, no bigger than a typical young co-op founded by a few friends or activists. In any case, it should be small enough to ensure appropriate conditions for every member to have a voice, to express his or her opinions, and express his or her will. There should be no a priori number of team members. And the composition of each team should be fluid. It should change not only according to the tasks, but also with the members' needs and desires. If any minority finds that their interest not being taken into account, it should be free to leave the team or group and initiate its own, but still being a part of the same large structure or network and keeping the advantages. For example, the access to the common wholesaler or database of customers and so on. So Abramowski noted, as Abramowski noted, this is a superiority of institutions of the common compared to the more traditional forms of democracy. In the co-ops and other associations alike, the majority has no power over the minority. Every time when minority feels suppressed or ignored by majority, it can, let's say, separate and reconnect on a different basis. Network or a league of co-ops is not a territorial entity like a state. Neither Kołakowski nor Wolski explained the decision-making process in such a teams. Although based on some clues they left, I believe that decisions aren't made here only by voting, but also by consensual decision-making. For example, Wolski explained that the conflicts should be resolved by the arbitrators accepted by all parties. This means not voting and imposing minority the judgments of majority, but rather a process of searching for the solution satisfactory for all. Okay, those are some general rules and the description of the first level. Each first level team is dedicated to fulfill specific tasks or meet specific needs, and its members should have a full authority to decide how to achieve these goals. But when they encounter an issue that is beyond their exclusive interest and competencies, a matter that concerns the members of other teams, the team does not proceed alone, but refers the issue to the next level. In this case, the team chooses a delegate who will express opinion and will of the team at this following level. I quote, "In the discussed system, the delegate is," Kołakowski wrote, "the spokesman for the opinion and will of his or her team. In such a system, there is no place for a delegate's independence. The independence that results from a lack of relationship with his or her mandataries. The delegate acts strictly in accordance with the instructions received from the team that delegate him or her." End of quote. The position of delegate is not a term of office during which he or she maintains a certain independence. On the contrary, the delegate has to explain all his or her decision and can be revoked at any time. These second level teams should be as little as possible, consisting of no more than 5 to 6 people. It means that side matter should concern no more than 5 to 6 other first level teams. Let's say a typical first level team is dedicated to meet its task or fulfill needs. The second level team, the team of delegates, is dedicated to discussing and resolving the goals of the larger workers or users section. If the matter concerns more general issues, it should be discussed on the third level, let's say department level or a branch level, and so on and so on. I will discuss now an example of publishers and readers cooperative presented by Jan Wolski. Such a co-op brings together both workers and users. The workers should be divided into autonomous teams of editors, translators, printers, bookbinders, administration teams, and so on. The users group split into 2 categories, providers and customers. Providers are book authors and graphic artists. Authors would be divided, for example, into the teams of novelist, juvenile literature authors, handbook authors, popular science book authors, and so on. Customers into teams, or rather groups of buyers of fiction, school textbooks, books for children, subscribers of a newspaper, and so on. Of course, each person can belong to the different teams at the same time. One can be a member of bookbinders team, as well as in the teams of novels, handbooks, and newspapers buyers. Between these teams can exist not only a sectional federation, for example, the Federation of Book Editors, but also kind of an intersectional federation. For example, an intersectional federation of handbooks publishers, bringing together the teams of authors, graphics, editors, bookbinders, and buyers. Such a fragmentation of the cooperative into smaller units create the best conditions for everyone to protect their actual interest and develop their democratic and solidaristic competences. And at the same time, composing these small units into one federation with multitude of levels and intersectional groups ensure them growing economic and political position, independent of the state apparatus. I'm aware that for some of you, the multi-level federalism might look like an overcomplicated form of organization. But I think it looks as such only on paper. Wolski convinced us that for most people, the multi-level federalism is completely intuitive. As an organization form similar rather to the fluid living organism than to the centrally controlled mechanical device.
Cezary, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm not sure whether you received my message on chat.
No. Sorry.
You're running out of time. So if you please.
Okay.
Wrap it up a bit, and and move towards conclusions. Thank you.
Okay. Just one more fact. In 1948, Julian Bobrownicki, a close associate of Jan Wolski, helped to implement the principles of multi-level federalism into the Longshoremen Workers' Co-op. This co-op associated over 3,000 workers and operate pretty effectively until it was taken over the 50s by the Stalinist state apparatus. So a short conclusion. I choose the theory of multi-level federalism as an example of such a form of organization that avoids both structural perils I mentioned at the beginning. Instead of small, separated and dependent from free market co-ops, and instead of large homogenic co-ops leagues, we need some kind of the alliance of heterogenic units. And I think the multi-level federalism seems like a good starting point for searching of an alternative. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cezary, for this very rich presentation, full of ideas and historical or examples stemming from historical analysis. And I think your presentation leads us perfectly into the questions part. So you've heard all three presentations, very dense, full of interesting ideas and claims. So we have 15 minutes, but I think I can negotiate with organizers a few minutes more if the discussion turns out to be interesting and ongoing. So please either raise your hands using the Zoom function, hands raising, or if you can't find it or can't use it for any reasons, please write on chat that you have a question, or write the question on chat. I can read it. I can read it out. Or in worst case scenario, just please turn on your microphone and tell me that you have a question. So I'm opening the question part. Is there any question to some or all of our presenters? Not seeing any questions, which it seems a bit.
We have a question from Sean Pitt.
Yeah, I see that. So please, Sean, ask a question.
Hey, yeah, thank you for your papers. They're all very interesting. I had a quick question / suggestion for, is it Michał? Sorry, I'm not very good at pronouncing Polish names. But my suggestion was, I'm not sure if you've read any of the work of the Scottish sociologist and botanist Patrick Geddes, who I'll talk about at length in my paper. But basically, in the early 1880s, he grappled with this this concept of symbiosis, and he was basically looking for a way to describe what he saw as not symbiosis, as cooperation. And I think he just provides quite a nice little story of someone who is kind of encountering this before Kropotkin and before it's kind of, and you know, the words of Owen, I haven't quite kind of transcended to science yet. So I just think he's quite an interesting figure for you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I assume this is the end of your exchange, or do you have? Yeah, so this will be enough. Are there any other questions or comments or ideas? Anything you would like to share with all the conference participants?
I have two, Bartłomiej Błesznowski. I have two issues to Pospiszyl's presentation, in contrary to the concept of symbiosis. The first one is that for me it was quite difficult to think cooperation as something narrower than symbiosis, because in 19th century literature this term symbiosis is connected strictly with biological sense for me, and cooperation is a concept which is present in many spheres and disciplines, also biological, both biological and political and social and economical, maybe especially. And I think that for me it is a strange idea that we should think cooperation as strictly connected to the liberal concept of man and liberal idea of subject. Maybe only when we will think about the chapter about cooperation in Marx's Capital, which is for me one of the, which is a good and bad point to think about this term. And I think that maybe if you can show us how this concept of symbiosis should be should be think as something wider than cooperation, than sociability in this general sense. Because in many books from the time, from the utopian socialists, from some evolutionists, like some books of, for example, of neo-Lamarckists, it is possible rather to see cooperation as something similar to Deleuze's concept of machine, as an immanent and primal mechanism of creating the every kind of connection in the world, of every kind of connection and building and assemblages. And this reference to your presentation is quite critical in this sense. And the second one is additional to that, because it is possible to think, to find one of the lines of genealogy of cooperative subject in liberal mind, but I think that this is only one of these lines, not the strongest one. I think that this cooperative subject, especially in Polish case, is thinking for many Polish socialists and organizers of cooperativism, and for example architects in Polish context, because those people are very interesting example in this case. For example, Helena Syrkusowa, as an rather entity, as a final point of the coop development, than individual as a free actor of market sphere and blah blah blah. And because of that, the subject is for me more precisely connected with the post-structuralist or structural vision of subject as a praxis, not as a presupposed figure of a market homo economicus. What do you think about that? Sorry for very long speech.
So, thank you for this for those questions. Really difficult in some extent and interesting, but I think that there is not only on some level of analysis there are only words, you know, that because I try to show that what I my critical notes about cooperation was connected with this particular this particular concept of cooperation, which was present in Marx's Capital, but it was also quite influential. We can find the you know the traces of this way of thinking in many cooperative thinkers. Even in Abramowski works, we can find this kind of argument that we should be a part of cooperatives because it is more effective, more beneficial, and so on and so on. And what I wanted to say in my paper is not to completely criticize this concept of cooperation. Maybe it would be better to think about it in different angle, and concept of symbiosis gives us this kind of different point of view, especially important in my opinion in the age of a climate crisis.
Okay, we also have a question from Sarah Holtgrave, sorry, to Łukasz.
Yes, thanks. Can you hear me fine?
Very fine.
Good, then I will continue. Yes, dear Łukasz, just you said that gleaning for you is the subsistent or the revolutionary aspect of commoning. And your thesis was that these other forms of commoning as traditional community landkeeping in Nepal or urban farming or so on were not revolutionary enough. Oh, sorry, I understood you. And if I got you right, the revolutionary aspect here is the work against enclosure of commons that is done by this gleaning processes of collecting stuff left over. I opposed to that viewpoint, though it was very interesting for me to hear. My question or my point of view is that commoning, or to put it differently, my understanding, commoning is much more about the processes of doing things together, whereas a gleaner usually does things alone, I'd say, even though in a collective setting of society, of course. And that, yeah, so my question to you would be that if you don't also see a revolutionary potential in all these self-supplying, learning to organizing communities and groups that try to find niches within society to grow vegetables themselves again, or to repair bikes and to upcycle them beyond the logic of capitalism. So for me, all these examples from Silke Helfrich and so on are very revolutionary indeed, and I can't see how we should learn to organize in new ways beyond capitalism, if not in such groups. So yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I can clarify some things, because clearly there is some little misunderstanding here between us, because it was not my intention to claim that only gleaning is revolutionary, okay, and that these all forms of commoning are pro-capitalist, defensive, and so on and so on. On the contrary, I think that all these forms of commoning can be subversive and radical, but gleaning for me is the most elementary example on which I can show what should be the parts of the revolutionary practice. So the main thing is to refuse the enclosures, right? The second thing is to invite to commoning together, so opening private or public property for the common, for the possibility of gaining the means of subsistence, and to get rid of this progressivist thinking that we should always be more efficient in a narrow economic sense than capital forms of private property and capital forms of cooperation. So I think that this potential that the gleaning may have could be also found in many other niches, as you said, in capitalist society. And here I'm following John Holloway and his remarks from the book Crack Capitalism, that there are so many ruptures and crack in capitalism that we should learn and be able to appropriate them, not appropriate, but communalize them and to glean together on them. So I see here gleaning also in broader non-literary way, as maybe we can glean in offices, maybe we can glean in factories, you know, that the main aim of our work is not to produce value, but is to remain in this symbiosis relation towards our other commoners, okay?
Thank you a lot.
Thank you very much for everybody who has already engaged in the discussion. Oh, I see there is another question to Łukasz. I will read it out. It's from Claudia Firth. The question is, would you like Claudia to join us and pose the question yourself?
Sure, it was just to follow on from the discussion, really. I was then curious about what Łukasz thought about the relationship between gleaning and governance, because the way I understand commoning is a practice of governance as much as around the actual resources themselves. So I was curious to know what he thought about, what you thought about that, Łukasz.
Yeah, it's also a great question, because you are right that especially today, after Elinor Ostrom influential work on governing the commons, we know that we need to develop proper governing forms to defend the commons and to use the commons in an efficient way. And in fact, we know from the history of the plebeian classes that I try to sketch in very fast way, that there were many forms of self-governing on the commons, also in relation to gleaning. For example, there was institution of the gleaning lady and gleaning bell. So the institution that signalized the start of the procedure of gleaning after the harvest and the end of the procedure. In that way, every commoner had the same rights and the same time to gain a subsistence. There were also procedures to open gleaning, especially for widows, orphans, and the weaker parts of society. So the governing forms in gleaning were closely related to the wider mode of governance on the commons in the history of the plebeian classes. So also to sharing the communal grounds, to participate in festivities, to collecting herbs, collecting wood, and here is also, of course, the chance, the possibility to ecological responsibility and reproduction of the forest or the pasture in an eco-friendly way. So yeah, that's why it's also an interesting practice for me, because here the governance is from the very start ascribed in the practice of gleaning. Of course, we can find gleaning as a form of violation of private property, as a theft that is taking part in the night, of course, but gleaning became such an illegal practice after the enclosures. So it is not the same gleaning that we had in the past when it was a part of the moral economy. And here's the big question: can we regain this moral economy, or have the moral economy in some novel way?
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we have slowly reached the time limit of our session. But if there's maybe one more question or one more comment you would like to pose, the last moment we can do that. If not,
excuse me, can I ask one question?
Yeah, sure. And this will be the closing question.
Yeah, okay. I have a question to Łukasz Moll. Thank you very much for very interesting presentation. But I was wondering if gleaning really was a subversive practice, or could be rather regarded as a kind of symbiosis with the system. It reminds me of today homeless people gathering garbage and recycling it. So it could be regarded as a function of rather cleaning up after, after the ruling classes, so to say. So I would be really happy to hear your opinion.
Yeah. Of course, you are right. There is always a danger to misrecognize plebeian practice. We think that it is a subversive practice, but maybe it is just a very defensive and defensive practice of the powerless people who have nothing else to do to gain the means of subsistence. And in my paper that I mentioned, I also discussed this dilemma, because French historian of gleaning. Her surname is Vardy, similar to Varda, were against E.P. Thompson and historians of gleaning in the UK. She claimed that, especially in France, the role of gleaning was rather different than in England. So in England, we've got the gleaning as part of moral economy and a subversive practice, and these struggles around the right to glean. And in France, it was the procedure of power. So in very Foucault style, gleaning was top-down reform that was started by the sovereign power in order to give some scraps to the most destitute groups in the society, and in the same time to gain free of charge reproductive labor, because we should remember that gleaning here is also the kind of reproductive labor that is valuable for the private property. So yeah, this is this big dilemma. Is it a subversive practice, or maybe is it the procedure of the dominant classes? And I think it is contextual. I don't have ready-made answer that is universal to all cases, right? So I think that every case needs proper evaluation of itself.
Thank you very much.
So many thanks for everybody who joined us in this opening main session of the conference. Many thanks for all three speakers for their great presentations. And hopefully we will have a very productive day and a very productive conference altogether. I will now give the voice to the organizers for any technical information. As the chair of this panel, once again, thank you very much for participating, for posing questions, and for your time. Thanks.